My name is Sophie Raine, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. So this workshop today is going to be looking at frame narratives and unreliability in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So what I want you to bear in mind as we go through that there are multiple layers of this story. So we begin with Captain Walton on his journey through the Arctic when he's writing letters to his sister, Mrs. Saville, in England. So these letters frame the entire narrative. So it's really important to remember that as we skip through to the other narratives that are contained within that. So then obviously he meets Victor Frankenstein, and then Victor Frankenstein kind of takes over the narrative, obviously again channeled through Captain Walton. And then within Frankenstein's story, we get the creature story. So in this session, I want to consider the reliability of Captain Walton and Victor Frankenstein in particular. So in addition to presenting their stories, they are also trying to represent stories of the other characters. And we'll talk about why that's significant. So as I said, what I'm going to invite you to do throughout the workshop is to think about oral storytelling and its tradition. The epistolary narrative, so that is the frame narrative or the use of letters to frame a story, which is what we refer to as the epistolary narrative, and its effects, and the effect of having a multitude of voices in the novel. So what it's doing to reliability, what it's doing to our impressions of the characters, and what kind of overall importance does it have to the narrative. So some of these themes will overlap. And the session will comprise of me giving you some possible reasons and interpretations, as well as giving you the chance to pause the recording and comment and complete some activities. Okay, so just a little bit of background there. So in 1816, Mary Shelley, who at the time was known by a maiden name as Wollstonecraft Godwin, and a lot of other famous Romanticist writers, such as Lord Byron, John Polidori, Claire Clairmont, and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy Bysshe Shelley would later become Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin's husband. Lord Byron, when they were staying at a villa in Lake Geneva, particularly bad weather, so they couldn't really go out and holiday as they had planned to do. What they decided to do was Lord Byron suggested they all tell ghost stories. And out of that, Mary Godwin wrote what would later become the novel Frankenstein. And it was published with its subtitle, The Modern Prometheus, in 1818. Okay, so just talking about the structure of Frankenstein then. So there's a number of ways of viewing this narrative structure, as I've said. So there's the frame narrative, the epistolary narrative, which is in the form of letters. Another way we can describe the structure is describing it as mise en abîme. Okay, so that is French for into the abyss. Okay, so it's a technique where a work of art makes reference to itself. So an image within an image or a scene within a scene, as you can see on the slide here, where we've got that camera. You'll also see it in things like halls of mirrors, where there's just repeated reflections, and that's what that is. So this is a kind of Russian doll type structure. So it allows the narrator to enter the story of others, and it disorientates the reader through what we refer to as temporal ruptures, okay? So disruptions in the timeline, okay? Flashbacks forward, and various things like that. So at the end of the novel, for example, Walton encounters the monster. So the monster steps outside of Victor's story and becomes part of the overarching narrative. So it's really important to remember the interconnectedness of these frame narratives and this network of narrators that we have, okay? That the stories aren't quite neatly contained within themselves. There's numerous ways, as I say, of approaching the text, but I want to think about how it engages with a multitude of different voices and styles. So I first want to think about the tradition of oral storytelling and the trope of the found manuscript. So the found manuscript has been a trope in Gothic since its inception. So it's often cited as beginning with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto in 1764. So this 18th century, so some years before Shelley was writing. So there's a multitude of reasons, why writers in the Gothic tradition chose to use this. So the idea that the text was sort of a found archive, in an archive and not attributed to an author, or the kind of origin is unknown, it gives this text both a sense of mystery and intrigue, but it also gives it a type of authority, okay, if it's claiming to be true. So in the same way that that horror films now, for example, might say based on true stories, even if it's only very, very loosely based, it's to give that kind of sense of, I suppose, authority, and it also there's kind of a sort of horror that comes with that as well. And it also kind of maintains a level of distance for the reader. Okay, so when Captain Walton is listening to Frankenstein's story, he's removed from it. Okay, so perhaps it is kind of given that sort of bit of distance as well. And so by the point that Shelley was writing, this was already a bit of a tired and overused trope. It had been used multiple times in Gothic literature and also been satirised quite heavily. So the text itself is a type of found manuscript. So it consists of unsent letters by Captain Walton to his sister Mary Saville. So by the end, obviously, he is sending them with a kind of not really sure who is going to respond. So it becomes a bit more like a travel log in a way. So by the end as well, it becomes clear that Captain Walton is no longer writing to correspond with his sister, but he's attempting to record the story of Victor Frankenstein. Okay, so that is the kind of most important thing for him. So he states, quote, "A scene has just passed through such uncommon interest that, although it's highly probable that these papers may never reach you, yet I cannot forbear recording it." So Walton here wishes to record his legacy and preserve his story for future generations, even when there's no known reader. Okay, the reader of Shelley's novel is the one who's meant to discover the manuscript. So Captain Walton, as the writer of the manuscript, transcribes the tale from the oral storytelling form into the written form. So these two different forms, oral storytelling and the discovered manuscript, are at odds with each other in a way. So while the Gothic manuscript, as I previously mentioned, gave a sense of sort of authority and legitimacy, it claimed to be true, and it kind of has its basis on that with it's being documented, meant to be written by an unbiased third party. Oral storytelling in this case kind of does the opposite. So typically oral storytelling is posited as unreliable the more it's passed down. Because the original meaning gets lost between narrators. So the next person who tells a story will maybe miss things out, or they might include things or embellish things. So oral storytelling is not as reliable because it's almost in a way kind of performance as well. But also it's to do with the memory of the person who originally told it and all the subsequent people after that. Okay. So while Walton kind of circumvents this by attempting to write directly from the source, Victor Frankenstein's story also contains oral storytelling within it. So the monster story, for example. So with each layer, the reliability of the narrative lessens as we move further away from the original source. So Victor is reciting his recollection of the monster telling his story. Okay, so and obviously he's going to have his own biases and his own kind of prejudices that he brings to that story. And also, again, kind of memory. So it's not going to be kind of documented word for word in the way that Walton wants to record it. It's not going to be incredibly accurate. So thinking about oral storytelling, so when it's described verbatim, which is what Walton is claiming to try and do, it brings up further questions about narrative reliability. So oral storytelling, particularly done on a more intimate sort of one-to-one basis, like in this kind of interview style that he seems to have with Walton in a way, is also subject to interpretations and may further fragment the narrative. So on the slide here, there are two examples of where Victor actually interrupts himself to acknowledge his listener and their reaction to the story. So even though Captain Walton hasn't said anything, he's done something that's made Victor kind of stop his story and kind of lose his train of thought in a way. So the first quotation on the slide states, "But forget I am moralising in the most interesting part of my tale, and your looks remind me to proceed." And the second one I have here from page 31, from a little bit earlier, is, "I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret with which I am acquainted, and that cannot be." Okay, so what I want you to do here, so the narrative is interrupted and we, the reader, are kind of brought back to the present, okay, moment with Walton and Frankenstein. Okay, so we move back into the main frame. So I want you to pause the recording here and consider this question. So why has Shelley chosen to disrupt the narrative? And how does this impact on the way that we see Victor Frankenstein as a narrator and as a result, his narrative. So if you want to pause the recording now and then press play when you're ready to continue. Okay, so all of these ways all of these parts kind of factor into how we view Victor Frankenstein, okay? So the interruptions remind the reader that this is a story which is subject to interpretation and relies on the memory and objectivity of the storyteller. So we are taken out of it, okay? We were fully immersed in this story, and it's easy to kind of forget that this is something that is being transcribed by Captain Walton, okay? This is something that's been found in a letter, okay? So we're being reminded that it's a story, we're being reminded that it's fiction, okay? And that'll obviously impact on how we view it. Secondly, Victor is interrupted by the verbal cues of his listener. So as a result, he omits part of his story. So he was going off on a bit of a tangent, but he says kind of, you know, I'm moralising, but your eyes tell me I need to kind of proceed. Or your looks tell me I need to proceed, sorry. So what we're doing there is we're actually getting a bit of the story omitted. So there might have been something really important that he wanted to share, but because of his because of the listener, he changed his mind. Okay, and it makes us think as well, what else might he not be telling us? Okay, what else might he be sort of holding back? So interruptions in the story are kind of from a typical found manuscript form. Okay, so the story is kind of being told and edited simultaneously. So he is able to kind of obviously remember things as they occur to him. He is able to go back and kind of add in some facts as he wishes. And he's also able to sort of embellish for the narrator as well. Okay. So yeah, what I want to think about as well, so this next part is not just oral storytelling as a form, or Victor Frankenstein as perhaps unreliable. I want to think about Frankenstein as a storyteller, as an orator, as someone who is a gifted speaker, and what that might be telling us. So I want you to have a look at these two quotations on the slide. Okay. So, and I want you to think, what purpose might Mary Shelley have for presenting Frankenstein as a gifted storyteller? Okay, so having a think here. So the first one here on page 14. Even now, as I commence my task, his full-toned voice swells in my ears. His lustrous eyes dwell on me with their melancholy sweetness. I see his thin hand raise in animation, while the lineaments of his face are irradiated by the soul within. So that is Captain Walton, right at the beginning. And then towards the end, this is before the sailors are kind of planning a mutiny on the boat. It says, even the sailors feel the power of his eloquence. When he speaks, they no longer despair. He rouses their energies. And while they hear his voice, they believe these vast mountains of ice are molehills which will vanish before the resolutions of man. Okay, so have a think, what is being done here? Why are we presenting Frankenstein in this way, and what might it kind of tell us? Okay, so if you want to pause the recording and have a bit of a think about this, and unpause when you're ready to continue. Okay, so Frankenstein's eloquence and his expressiveness when telling his story kind of win over the captain, who admires him and he aspires to be like him, as well as trying to befriend him. His eloquence earns the trust of the captain, as we see, and also it earns the trust of the crew. So this could be warning us actually of Frankenstein's eloquence. He's able to prevent a mutiny due to his rousing speech. He's persuasive and he can manipulate others with kind of his gifted storytelling and his gifted kind of speech. So if Frankenstein can manipulate the captain and the crew through this use of language, he can also manipulate the reader. And he might be distorting the events of his story, which we find out at the end, there is a level of kind of distortion to make himself look a little bit better. And he's relying on his kind of poetic speech to kind of cajole the audience and distract from his own kind of personal moral failings in a way. Okay, so there's two primary narrators in the story. So they are Captain Walton and Victor Frankenstein. So the monster constitutes a third sort of less prevalent and less autonomous narrator who is being reported through Frankenstein. So which of these narrators, if any, do you consider reliable? So I know we've talked about that a little bit about Frankenstein, but having a think about them kind of all together really. If they are unreliable, what prejudices and biases may affect their ability to tell the story objectively? So press pause when you consider this question, and then press play when you're ready, and we'll address of each of these narrators. Okay, so to start with Captain Walton. So every narrative voice is ventriloquized by Captain Walton. So each voice is subject to his interpretation. Okay, and we mustn't forget that. So what I want to think about this is this theory that Dorothea Walshack discusses, which is the theory of mediacy. So I'll just read this out. It's a quote from Walshack. So this theory relates to a narrator with whom the reader identifies and therefore constructs sort of a bridge between the fictional story and the real reader. The aim is always to create the illusion of truth and reality. Only a successful mediacy can seduce the reader to accept the fictional world under their actual realm of experience. Okay, so we trust Walton more because he is an alleged unbiased third party. The objectivity of Walton is a little bit uncertain, though, and we're going to discuss that now. So I've put a short extract on here, and I want us to have a think about this question at the end in relation to what Walshack talked about in relation to the theory of mediacy. So I have resolved every night, when I'm not imperatively occupied by my duties, to record, as nearly as possible in his own words, what he has related during the day. If I should be engaged, I will at least make notes. This manuscript will doubtless afford you the greatest pleasure, but to me, who know him and who hear it from his own lips, with what interest and sympathy I shall read this in some future day. Okay, so how does Shelley attempt to create a successful mediacy through Captain Walton's letters? How is, if we go back to what Walshack was saying, how are they trying to create an illusion of truth and reality? Okay, so to kind of seduce the reader into accepting the fictional world. Okay, and the reader is obviously us, but it could also be his sister as well. Okay, so how is he trying to do that? So if you want to pause the recording and then press play when you are ready to continue. Okay, so Walton acts as a way of filtering Victor's story, and that distance gives us a sense of legitimacy or truth, that as if we just heard it from Victor Frankenstein himself. He states it will be as nearly as possible in his own words, which shows how important accurately recording this is. However, this is undermined a little bit. As he explains, if he's busy, he will make notes. The reader's then going to perhaps struggle to differentiate what is being directly said by Victor and what is just the kind of shorthand or note-taking from Captain Walton. And what of this has been kind of the captain's inferences as well, as he's putting his own kind of opinions into this. The purpose of the manuscript as well is sort of questioned here. So it's kind of to entertain, okay, as he says, it will afford his sister the greatest pleasure. So it's debatable as to whether the reader can, to paraphrase Walshack, accept this fiction as reality when the captain is already anticipating its purpose being to excite or engage the reader, rather than to acknowledge a great scientific feat or warn others of the consequences of moral failings, for example. So it's kind of going off what the found manuscript is meant to do. So in the preface of a number of kind of Gothic texts that are claiming to be found manuscripts, they often just state the seriousness and truth and how its intention is to inform and warn, okay? By mentioning entertainment in there, Captain Walton kind of just the opposite in a way. Okay. So as well as that, we've identified kind of a few other reasons why Captain Walton might be unreliable. So Walton is biased towards Victor as he feels in bitter want of a friend. Okay, so he feels an affinity to Frankenstein as well as feeling lonely because they both want to be pioneers in their field and they're both driven by ambition. He sees a lot of himself in them. Frankenstein and Walton are kind of almost mirrors of each other. Walton listens to Frankenstein's story in a rather unreflective manner. So he focuses instead on Frankenstein's abilities as a storyteller, okay? He doesn't really critique the narrative as much as he should do, if he's claiming to be as sceptical as he initially said that he was. So Walton's recording of events is interspersed with his own personal reactions to the story. So for example, it says, "You have read this strange and terrific story, Margaret, and do you not feel your blood congeal with horror, like even which now curdles mine?" So again, he's adding a bit of sensation to it, and he obviously has his own kind of opinions and reactions, which is going to cloud the judgment of the reader. Okay, he's not allowing the reader to be unbiased as well. Okay, so Victor Frankenstein, we talked a little bit about his bias. Okay, so Frankenstein regularly questions his own sanity and reminds Walton, the reader, of when he kind of suffered from delirium. Okay, he says, I remembered also the nervous fever with which I was seized just at a time that I dated my creation, and which would have given an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so improbable. Okay, so he is already kind of casting doubts in our mind about his mental state when this all happened. Frankenstein, while articulate, lacks self-reflection and cannot comprehend the motivations of the creature, which are very different from his own. And that is their kind of a kind of interpretation by a critic called Dunn, which is in the bibliography at the end. So yeah, he's kind of unable to see another point of view as well. So he always, for example, sees kind of maliciousness in the creature, whereas he's unable to acknowledge some of the kind of positive parts or his own kind of responsibility or role within that. Also, according to Emily Anderson, another critic, says that Victor frequently conflates faith and knowledge. Okay, so for example, he says that he knows that the creature, killed Justine, but he doesn't know that, he just believes that. Okay, which he later says. So he is kind of quite liberal with the truth, and he's quite unreliable in that way, in that he will make kind of these sort of total statements without kind of much evidence to sort of back them up. Okay, so we're looking at the creature's story. We're going to look a little bit sort of less about this because, as I said, it's sort of subject to Frankenstein's interpretation, so we don't get much of the creature as a storyteller. But yeah, so I want to have a look here, at another quote about the creature's story here. So, the monster's storytelling breaks the metonymic chain of associations that make ugliness a plausible indicator of innate evilness, and asserts that physical deformity is devoid of any metaphysical meaning. Yet Frankenstein refuses to accept this claim. To Frankenstein, the monster's eloquence becomes just one of several indicators of his evil. Okay, so Victor Frankenstein actually warns Captain Walton to be careful of the monster's eloquence. Okay, so Frankenstein refuses to accept that this eloquence, this articulation, grants the creature any kind of humanity. And what's quite interesting is we can juxtapose this with Victor's own eloquence and what that kind of means to the other characters as well. So what is desirable in Victor, according to Walton, becomes quite manipulative in the creature. So this lack of self-reflection further makes Victor unreliable. So his presentation of the creature story becomes unreliable. Okay, so redactions and edits. So this is the final kind of point I wanted to really make. So near the end of the text, Walton's narrative acknowledges that it's been previously edited. So Frankenstein discovered that I had made notes concerning his history. He has to say them, and then then himself corrected and augmented them in many places, but principally in giving the life and spirit to the conversations conversations he held with his enemy. Since you have preserved my narration, said he, I would not that a mutilated one should go down in prosperity. So Frankenstein kind of commandeers his own story there, and he makes all these revisions and amendments. So we're actually unsure at the end whether this is kind of to correct mistakes, or whether it's to remove Walton's inferences and make it more reliable, or if it's to position Frankenstein as a more moral individual and cut out certain parts. And we just don't know, because we, as a reader, receive this manuscript in a redacted form. Okay, it's omitting a great deal of details, and we don't obviously know what they are. So after weaving through a network of unreliable narrators and a multitude of interweaving narratives, this revelation shows the entire narrative to be a fragment of the true story. So we're never getting the full story here. Is the kind of main sort of take home. Okay, so just in summary, Frankenstein undermines the authority of the Found Manuscript trope by including a host of unreliable narrators in a complex frame narrative. Oral storytelling furthers the unreliable and fragmented nature of the text, which is at the mercy of Victor Frankenstein's memory in his interpretation of the story. The epistolary form places Captain Walton as a mediator, but his objectivity is compromised through his personal motivations. His subsuming of multiple voices makes it difficult to obtain a holistic, objective perspective. Okay, and here is a list of works cited if you wish to do any further reading around the subject. And thank you for watching, listening, and participating in this workshop. If you're interested in learning about what it's like to study English literature or creative writing at university, you can start with our website, and the link is there. Feel free to contact us with any questions. Thank you.